This time on Evolution Woodworks, I'm dealing with lots of angles, some tricky transitions, and a project that really had me wanting to throw the towel in at times.
There's still a flake there. Gosh.
Like most people who build things for a living, my personal projects tend to take a backseat to the customer builds, and my wife's been asking me for a china cabinet for, well, let's just say a few years. For one reason or another, it's just never been built. Now we finally decided on a spot for it, so after a few designs, I came up with something she liked, and I got to work on it. I started out by cutting this maple plywood down for the carcass, but before I cut it to its final size, I need to run some dados across it for the shelves to fit into later. To make sure they all line up, I'm cutting them in while it's still one big sheet. I taped down some plywood strips using another piece of plywood to get the spacing perfect, and then used a template bit in the router to cut the dados out. This is going to be a corner cabinet, so once I had all the dados cut in, I tilted the blade over to 22.5 degrees on the table saw and started ripping all the parts down to size. Set up the biscuit joiner to cut on the 22.5 degree angle and cut in a bunch of slots in all the panels. This should help keep things aligned when I get to the glue up. The only corner cabinets I've ever built have been kitchen cabinets where you can pretty much just screw into the back wherever you want to for assembly and nobody's ever going to see it again. This being a freestanding piece of furniture, I had to get a little more creative on ways to hold the parts together while the glue dried. I cut out some blocks with the 22.5 degree angle on them and taped them onto the panels with double stick tape. The idea was to have a square surface to clamp across the 45 and hold it while the glue was drying. It worked out pretty good this time, but it wasn't perfect. I actually came back to find some of the blocks had come loose and clamps were laying on the floor, but luckily the glue had dried before they let go. I put some blue tape on the inside to help with glue squeeze out, slid some angled blocks in the dados to keep things aligned, and then glued and clamped it all together. While the glue was drying on the carcass, I laid out the two fixed shells that'll be glued in and cut them out with the track saw. As you can see, that's not exactly square at the moment, so I'm gonna go ahead and glue these shelves in and put some clamps on it to pull everything in square, and that'll help us with the next step. Once the glue had dried on the body, I spread some glue in the two dados and installed the shelves. I used clamps to pull the body together for a tight fit against the shelves and added one at the far end just to keep it from having any outward tension that might pull things out of whack as the glue is drying up. Alright, so for the rest of the body we're going to go with solid maple, and I'm actually going to change to a 1-inch thickness, so I need to make, once I get everything milled up, I need to make this little detail on the last piece of the body that's going to be the straight sides, and that's going to let that sit. It's just going to sit down over this square edge that I left on the plywood, and that'll change my thickness and cover all my edges so that you don't see the transition between the 3/4 inch plywood and the 1-inch maple. This is not maple, this is just a test piece. So let's go mill some maple down and we'll get ready for that. Set the blade to 45 degrees and then adjusted it up to the thickness of the plywood. Then I added a sacrificial fence and some feather boards to help hold the pieces tight while I fed them into the saw. After my first test cut, I realized my auxiliary fence wasn't square to the table. I tried shimming it out, I even tried swapping in a different fence, but I couldn't get it square the full length of the fence. Finally, I ended up laying 4 or 5 layers of blue tape down on the top edge, and that was enough to get it square so I could get an accurate cut. For For the second half of the cut, I had to sacrifice the sacrificial fence just a little bit to get the angle perfectly where I wanted it. And with that, I had it all set up perfectly to make the transition from the 3/4 inch plywood to the 1 inch solid wood without any weird gaps showing up on the inside of the body. Once I finished cutting the angle groove down both pieces, I ripped them both down to the final width and laid out the stop dados for the shelves to slide into on the sides. And that's when I noticed I had uncovered this little guy when I ripped the edge off, but we'll deal with him later. The stop dados in using the router like I did earlier, and after taking the time to square the first one up perfectly, I realized I could just run them slightly long and they'll be covered up when I add the front face to the shelf. Alright, so right now I've got a bit of a problem. Not exactly unforeseen, I just really haven't come up with a good way to fix it yet. Got this on here, you can see out here on the ends I've got these blocks, and that's going to help me clamp this all down nice and tight. The problem is, in here, you can still see this little gap right here, and what it is this piece is bowed out and this piece is bowed out, and there's no way to grab right there. So sadly, I think the only good idea I can come up with right now is to screw some blocks on. And honestly, this is, it's going to be on the back side in the corner. This thing's going to get a super dark stain on it, so won't be too hard to hide the holes anyway. But I think that's about the only option I have right now. I can't seem to get this thing pulled together, and it's just a little bit of bow in each board, and nothing I can do about it. So I have some ideas for how to do this again in the future without screwing to the body, but this worked out fine this time around. I was able to get the pieces pulled together nice and tight with no gap, and I'll just fill the holes in before I stain the body, and no one will ever know. Well, you'll all know, but don't tell anyone, okay? Thanks. As we all know, you can never have enough clamps. Or in my case, you may never have enough of the right clamps. I have tons of big cabinet clamps and not very many of these smaller clamps, so lately I've found myself adding more and more of these to the collection. I'm sure in the future I'll probably get into something else where I still don't have enough of these ones or some other style of clamp that I don't even know exists yet. I cleaned all the loose stuff out of the bark inclusion as best I could and then just filled it up with a few layers of black CA glue. It's going to get a dark finish on this part of the cabinet, so it's just going to blend in when it's all done. Probably should have used epoxy here, but it got the job done. All right, next thing I need to do is make some end caps for these shelves, and that's going to end up being my doorstop, and the framing's actually going to come up underneath it. My original plan was to bring this up perfectly flush with this. I think now that I've seen it, I'm going to drop that back down maybe 3/16 to 1/4 inch. So I'm just going to ease these corners off, because what I'm finding is that's a nice sharp corner, and it's getting pretty fragile. I've actually already got a few chips and nicks in it, so I think if I just ease that off, maybe put a little round over on it, it's going to be a little better in the long run. So get some caps made up for this, for these guys, figure out what our depth's going to be with our doors now that it's not flush, and get everything cut down and glued in. I cut some caps for the front edges of the shelves, and since I don't have any edge banding clamps, see, told you there was something I didn't have, I just ran a bar clamp across and used a block with some shims to keep pressure on these while they dried. So this piece is going to be our framing. That's going to stick out between the doors. This little piece is going to go at the same depth as our shelf, and that's going to act as a doorstop, so our doors will sit flush inset evenly and have something on this bottom area to land against, the same as the shelf that's down there. Now these are gonna get glued to the sides. My shelf, I didn't glue it into the dado, and I didn't glue this front piece to the sides because this is solid wood and I don't have to worry about the expansion and contraction on that. So these two pieces are gonna get glued together, glued to the sides, and left with the shelf floating on top of them. So that should, in theory, let these sides move in and out without having any trouble with the shelf. So I need to get these glued in. I still need to cut a skirt board for the bottom and one more piece for the top. And we can get those glued in and clamped up. Before I add anything else that'll be in the way, I just use a hand plane and a sanding block to get these corners knocked down and rounded over nice and smooth. I use this little combination square to set my depth, and then I marked this out on the top frame so the doorstop would end up even with the middle shelf. Once that was done, I glued the stop to the frame and moved on to laying out the bottom skirt. For the curve on the skirt, I marked the center height and width out that I wanted it to be. Then I used some clamps and this metal straight edge to get an even curve drawn out all the way around. I cut the curve out on the bandsaw and cleaned it up with a spindle sander. I glued the skirt and the bottom frame together. Then when that was dry, I glued them into the body. After I stood the cabinet up for the first time, I planed the front faces down even with the shelves and started laying out the top. If you're wondering what that roar is in the background, that's just part of working in a metal building during a rainstorm. With the plywood cut to shape, I ripped down some strips of maple and started cutting the miters to wrap the top. I started out on the table saw with a sled, but then I remembered I had this other saw that was really good at cutting miters, so I screwed on a quick zero clearance fence and set my angle to 22.5 for the rest of the cuts. After I cut all the miters and had it all fitting perfectly, I cut in some biscuit slots to keep everything lined up during the glue up. I can't remember the last time I used a biscuit joiner this much on a project. Once I started using pocket screws and making more production style cabinets a long time ago, it really hasn't got much use. It's a good thing I still have it around though. Alright, got all my pieces cut. Everything's got biscuits in it and ready to go. The clamps are all laid out. Now I just gotta get glue on everything and get it all put together, clamped up before the glue dries. So I'm gonna use some Titebond 3. It's got a little bit longer open time than the Titebond 2 does, so hopefully that'll give me a little bit of leeway to get this done. So, all right, let's get some glue on and get this thing clamped up. Yeah, that should be enough clamps. We bought this table a few years ago when my shop was pretty much out of commission for any large projects, and this is what I need to match this cabinet to. The body is stained maple and the top is red elm. I couldn't find any elm locally, so I had to order some online, and what showed up wasn't exactly the straightest boards I've ever seen. I stacked and stickered the boards in the shop for about a month or so before I started on this project, and now I'm just trying to get them laid out to what I'll need for the door frames and get all the grain oriented as straight as I possibly can. Once I had all the parts laid out, I went over to the bandsaw and ripped it all out a little bit oversized from what I actually needed. Alright, I'm just gonna let that sit here till Monday. Let it do what it's gonna do, and then we'll try to straighten things up and get it cut down to size on Monday. Hopefully, get everything we need out of it. After letting it rest over the weekend, I started working on getting it flattened and straightened out on Monday. As you can see, it was going to take some work. After I had one face flat on the joiner, I ran the boards through the planer to get it down close to the thickness I'd need. Then I went back to the joiner to straighten an edge and ripped it all down on the table saw. Once I had the elm cut down to size, I resawed some maple to start building the panels for the lower doors. After I stopped to get yet another splinter out of my hand, I glued up the two panels, let them sit overnight, and sanded them down to size the next day. Alright, got the panels down to roughly 5/16 of an inch thick, so now I can go ahead and get our door frames all cut down to the right length and get the tongue groove cut in those. I took some measurements, did some math, and cut everything down to its final length using the crosscut sled and a stop block to make sure they were all equal. Once all the parts were down to length, I set up a dado stack slightly smaller than what I would need for the groove and then ran some test pieces until I was happy with the fit on the panel. To make sure everything was centered, I just ran the parts through one way, flipped them around, and ran them through again the other way. With all the grooves cut, I used the combo square to set the depth for the tongue cuts. Then using the cutoff fence as a stop block and the miter gauge to keep it square, I just nibbled away at the wood until it was nice and clean cut. I left the door frames a little bit oversized and a snug fit for now. I'll come back in a bit and fine tune that fit and all the gaps and clearances for the hinges. I cut the panels down to final size and test fit them in the frames. Then it was time for a drink. It was time to mix up a custom stain. I had to try and match the finish on the table and chairs, and since the frames will be stained a different color, I wanted to get the panel stained before I assembled them. I started off with a 50-50 mix of distilled water and denatured alcohol, then measured out a couple different colors of trans-tint dyes. Once I had a color match that I was happy with, I stained the panels and left them to dry. Since the upper doors were getting glass and not the stained panels, I went ahead and assembled them now and left them in the clamps overnight. In the morning, when the stain had dried well on the panels, I went ahead and assembled the lower door frames too. They say if you don't like the weather in Virginia, just wait a few minutes. In the few weeks that this project lasted, we had everything from temperatures in the 70s with thunderstorms to snow and ice and temperatures in the teens. So you just never know what you're going to get here. I ran the finished doors through the drum sander to make sure all the joints were nice and flat. Then I laid them in the cabinet and started working on the gaps and clearances until everything fit just right. Once I had the fit on the doors dialed into where I wanted it, I set up the hinge jig and bored out all the holes for the Blum hinges. Since the doors are inset even with the horizontal frame and not the side panels, I made a little jig to hold the plates at the correct depth and keep them square to the front edge. After I measured once, checked it with the gauge, measured it twice, checked it again with the gauge, and measured it a third time, I screwed the plates in place and, well... Yeah, I had measured from the inside of the doorstop and not the actual door opening, so there were a couple more holes to fill on that side, but not to worry, I did get it right on the other 3 doors. Got my doors pretty well fit up. I need to do some fine adjustment later on, but for now the gaps are looking pretty decent. The last thing I need to do is take this back edge of my tongue and groove off to get the glass in there. I'm just going to hold the glass in with some regular glazing points, and the glass won't be here till next week, but we do need to get these cleaned up and ready to put into finish. So I'm just going to take a rabbiting bit and knock this back edge off, and yeah, get that knocked out. Alright, so now obviously we just got to take these corners out, but there is one other problem. I cut these at 7/16 of an inch deep, and my rabbiting bit's only a 3/8 rabbiting bit, so I do have a little bit of a groove still left, or a little lip on top here. And my thought was I would come back in with a pattern bit and just zip that out. But unfortunately the bearing and the bolt that holds the bearing on is actually too tall, and can't get it in there. So wouldn't really be a big deal, but I already ordered the glass to fit that size. So I think I'm probably just gonna have to come in with a hand plane and chisel and just clean all that up until it's flush. Make sure everything's good so when the glass gets here it'll actually fit, and won't have to do any more work on that. So get these cleaned up, then we can make some shelves, and I think that's about it. We can start seeing it. This project was starting to get the best of me, and I had a lot going on outside of the shop that made it drag on a lot longer than it needed to. These little bits of added work were starting to add up, and unfortunately this wasn't the last of them. With the doors mounted and the hinges in place, I could now measure for the adjustable shelves and get them built. I cut down the plywood and some maple for the front edge. I left the plywood square so it was a little bit easier to glue up, and then after the glue had dried, I trimmed off the edges flush with the front, and then cut the corners off with a track saw. With the shelves done, I can finally start sanding and get this thing ready for finish. I won't bore you with a long sanding montage, but let's just say there was a lot of this and a lot of that. Hours and hours of that. I'm trying out this Natural One Coat for the final finish, and it says to only sand up to 120, so I'll leave it at that and we'll see how it goes. Once I had all the sanding done and everything was vacuumed and wiped down, I moved on to my second least favorite thing to do, cleaning the entire shop to get it ready for finishing. I wiped the first coat of stain on pretty heavily since we're going for almost solid color on the maple. I let that all soak in and didn't wipe it off like I normally would. I did end up with a little bit of blotchiness, but the second coat blended it all in pretty well. For the door frames, I used an oil-based stain to match the tabletop as best I could. I was very careful on the lower doors to not get any of this stain on the panels that were stained previously. After the stain had dried overnight, I came back and knocked down the grain on everything with a fine finishing pad, and unfortunately, with the stain highlighting everything, I could see a few spots on the doors where I didn't get all the sanding marks from the drum sander out. I hand sanded those spots until the marks were gone, restained them, and moved on to the second coat on the body. And don't forget to dispose of your oil-soaked rags in a fireproof container. They can spontaneously combust while they're drying and cause a fire. I've seen it happen with just a couple of rags, so it's better safe than sorry. Alright, everything's sanded and wiped down. Now we can finally get a finish on this project. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to be using this Natural One Coat. It's a hard wax oil. It's pretty similar to Rubio, which, I only used Rubio one time, and that was on countertops in the van, so that was just a nice flat surface. So I'm kind of going to have to figure this application process out as I go. I'm going to start with the shelves on the top and the doors, try to get things worked out, and then we'll move on to the carcass. Hopefully by then I'll have everything worked out on what my technique is, and we'll get a good finish laid down. So let's get some of this mixed up and we'll get started on that. The mix on this finish is 3 parts oil to 1 part hardener, and it a little bit goes a long way, so I only mixed up a small batch just to get started and see how far it would actually go. It does have a several hour open time to get it applied, so it's pretty forgiving in that respect. It's pretty simple to apply on a large flat surface. You can just pour it on and spread it around, but for this application I used a white applicator pad to get it into all the little details of the cabinet. Once I had a couple minutes to bond with the wood, you can just wipe it off with a lint-free rag until it feels dry. I used the 2-rag method here again to try to avoid any fingerprints in the finish. You ever had a project that just makes you question everything about yourself and your abilities? Got the whole thing stained and finished, and I come back out here this morning after all this, and there's a crack in the right in the front where you just can't not see it. So it's basically just a piece where the maple just flaked out, and apparently I just wanted to wait till I was done. So I think it's too late to put glue in there, so I'm probably just gonna have to sand it all out and try and finish that again. I thought I was coming out to do final assembly this morning, and that's what I found. So see what kind of trickery I can come up with. There was just an odd swirl in the grain here, like a tiny little knot, and a thin layer had just split the whole width of the front face and opened up after the finish had gone on. I tried to just sand out that spot, but I realized there was a couple of smaller ones above it, so I just used a card scraper to clean it all back down to the bare wood and made sure I got deeper than the cracks before I reapplied the stain and finish. Luckily, both of those are pretty forgiving to repairs, and you really couldn't even tell the difference once it was done, so moved on to putting the glass in the doors and trying to get this job finished. Just used these metal glazing points to hold the glass in the doors, and then once that was done, I could finally get this thing assembled and get it out of my shop. This is not even close to the largest project I've built, but it is by far the largest one since I started this channel. It's also going to be the longest video I've put out. I almost broke it up into 2 parts, but I'm kind of testing the waters on what y'all want to see, and the YouTube seems to be pushing the longer content these days. I'm still going to do smaller projects here and there that won't make for such long videos, but for the most part I intend on doing more furniture builds and less of the smaller projects. Let me know in the comments if you prefer the long format or if you'd like the shorter, maybe 15 to 20 minute stuff. As always, if you made it this far and you aren't already subscribed, why not go down and hit that button and give us a thumbs up too. Thanks. With all the final adjustments made on the hinges, I can finally disassemble it and move it to its new home in my dining room. I think it turned out to be a pretty good match considering I didn't build the table that it's sitting next to. The stain on the maple was pretty much spot on and the elm was very close. That could have been a little more red and maybe darker, but since it's an oil finish, I think it'll darken up over time and it'll match even better as it does. That's it for this one. It definitely pushed me out of my comfort zone, and it's always good to try new things and expand your skills. Hopefully it inspires you to do the same. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.